welcome to the Family Beacon podcast with Moses Bratrud and Grace Lawrence. We are so excited that you have joined us today. It's been a couple weeks, Grace, since it was you and me.
Yeah.
So that's fun.
Yeah, it is fun. And it's also fun because we're kind of using a different interface than we've normally done. I mean, I know you tested it out last week with Aaron Wren, which was a great episode, by the way. Loved it. But this is fun. I like it.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We're trying this out, folks, because we were working on a Zoom with Zoom, and the audio delay was really bad. So Grace and I weren't able to really hear each other very well. And so I hope that this will be better.
Yeah, that's right.
So coming up this week, we are so excited to talk about a couple things that we think are super important for us to know as we try to get the facts so that we can stand for truth. Grace will be starting out this episode talking about Mayo Clinic, and a doctor at Mayo Clinic, Dr. Mary O'Connor, spoke at a conference talking about the biological differences between men and women. Now, what was Mayo Clinic's response? They distanced themselves from her totally factual assertions that men and women are biologically different. So Grace will tell us more about that story. Following that, I will be talking about some research I've been doing into the political landscape, both nationally and here in Minnesota. Now that we're in June, we are in the final stretch before the 2024 election. And so I will be talking a little bit about that and some information that may be helpful for you guys as you think and pray about this coming election here in November. So without further ado, Grace, can you tell us more about what Mayo Clinic is up to?
Absolutely. So just this March, they had an event. It was their 2024 Advancing Academic Career and Excellence for Women. And that's just a great idea. I mean, a conference dedicated to advancing women in the academic sphere. That's awesome. And it is kind of interesting because you notice that it's for women only. Which, how dare they? How dare they have a conference dedicated to women? Now, that's not where they received the backlash, surprisingly. In fact, they actually received backlash because they had a doctor. Her name is Mary O'Connor, and she is on staff at Mayo at one of the Florida locations. And she is very, very prominent, has years of experience. She is a medical doctor and also a researcher who focuses on joint replacement. And she also focuses on the influence of gender in the treatment of arthritis and the differences in knee tissue when you are working on men versus women. And so, very basic biological facts there. Of course, she has a lot of very detailed expertise in this area, which is, of course, very valuable. So in addition to her medical work, Dr. O'Connor also often speaks out against biological men participating in women's sports. And that makes sense. I mean, if she's a doctor who specializes in certain things that point out the differences between men and women, especially when it comes to, knee tissue and treating arthritis, it makes sense that she would be against men competing against women because it's not a fair playing field because there are very clear biological differences. So here's where we get to the meat of the issue. So she spoke at this conference and yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, but I just learned something about why Dr. O'Connor is so passionate about women's sports. She was on the 1980 U.S. Olympic team and the Yale National Championship women's rowing team.
Wow.
In the pre-Olympic Games in Europe, the team set the world record and won a bronze medal. It actually says because the United States boycotted the actual 1980 Olympics, she wasn't able to actually participate. But I think that is and then she became an orthopedic surgeon. So that is just crazy to me. And I'm sorry to cut you off, but I thought, okay, so we clearly see that not just as a physician and as an orthopedic surgeon, but as an athlete, a distinguished Olympian, she is able to talk with ethos about why men and women
Mm.
are different and deserve their own separate sports teams and facilities. So I thought that was worth mentioning at this point.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Moses. Thanks for bringing that up. It makes me think of Boys in the Boat, which is a book about a rowing team who I think their team won against Germany, and it was like this groundbreaking thing. Rowing is a super intense sport, as that book and that movie makes really clear. And so that's cool that she was on a rowing team because I know it uses like every single part of your body. So,
Right.
very interesting. So, again, getting back to the drama, so to speak. So, Mayo Clinic, after the event, said that they would have, quote unquote, reconsidered its decision to invite a speaker to the conference had it known about Dr. O'Connor's social media posts. So, why exactly did they say that? Well, it's because after the conference happened, Rochester Pride, which is an LGBTQ organization that is sponsored by Mayo, which I think is hilarious. Because Mayo Clinic, is supposedly very rooted in science, and I'm sure that they are in many ways. But here they are sponsoring a group that goes against biological reality. Anyways, this group complained to Mayo about Dr. O'Connor's presence at the conference and the fact that she was a speaker. So they complained, and then Mayo responded, and they sent a statement back to this group. And here's what they said in that statement. They said that Dr. O'Connor's social media activity is, quote, inconsistent with Mayo Clinic values and does not represent the views of the organization. We realize this has caused hurt at a time when the transgender community is facing ongoing discrimination and attacks. So they said that. They didn't say for sure they would have not invited her, but they said that they may have reconsidered. And so that's interesting. Definitely, we're seeing some virtue signaling here. But wait, there's more. So after Mayo Clinic sent this statement, then this Rochester Pride group responded and said that they're grateful for Mayo addressing this issue. However, they said, quote, although we believe the statement still downplays the seriousness of Dr. O'Connor's actions, and there is still much work for Mayo Clinic to do in the fight against transgender bigotry and discrimination, we appreciate your willingness to listen, learn, grow, and do more to advocate for the most marginalized in our community. What are your thoughts, Moses?
It's really interesting. I think we've talked about this before, but here's just one more example of the cultural power of, in this case, the Rochester Pride organization. And Mayo Clinic is not only one of the premier hospitals in the entire world, but it's massive. It's huge. They raise massive amounts of money every year. Probably their revenue is in the billions for sure. And then you have this small local pride organization dedicated to LGBT, etc., in a secondary or tertiary city in Minnesota with 60 or 70,000 people. I don't know how much money they raise, but it could be well under $1 million per year. And I'm just trying to illustrate like how different the scale is. It's like the lion and the mouse, in the Aesop's fable, which is an interesting scenario, showing that a tiny little organization can overcome and make a huge organization grovel and apologize, just by dint of how these pride groups are seen as a sort of like a priesthood, where they give cultural sanction to various organizations who are considered woke enough, and withdraw that sanction when an organization is not being woke enough. And we just see corporations and clinics and hospitals just running scared. We've seen so many examples of this. Target just last year, all sorts of corporations and clinics who are just so afraid of not being woke enough. And I think in this particular case, as you said, it's just so artsy-versy, because Mayo Clinic should be dedicated to science. It should be dedicated to a clinician's statement that men and women have different bone and muscle tissue. I mean, it's just insane that that
Mm-hmm.
statement is being questioned. It's insane even from the, from the perspective of people who want transgender athletes to be able to compete on the teams that are associated with their chosen identity as opposed to their birth identity. Even many of those people would recognize that there are differences. So they say someone like Leah Thomas, well, that person is only able to compete on the women's team after undergoing hormone replacement therapy, and so that is supposed to lessen the competitive advantage. But there's like this tacit acknowledgement that there is a competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, why Leah Thomas should just be able to say I'm a woman, bam, next day she's on the University of Pennsylvania women's swimming team. But no, there was this process. I
Yeah.
don't think I think it only took a few months for that the fig leaf to be placed over. I think a fig leaf is actually a pretty apt description of what's going on here in terms of male athletes playing on women's teams. So, you
Mm-hmm.
know, in conclusion, Grace, it's insane to see one of the most powerful, you would think, respected cultural institutions, certainly in the state, but really nationally,
Yeah.
kowtow to this tiny little pride group over something that their doctor said, one of their doctors said, and so they're betraying their own doctor by failing to defend her in the public square or even attacking her in the public square.
Yeah.
And
Kind
go
of
ahead.
building off of that, Moses, what I think is interesting is like this narrative that this movement is building is that these people are very oppressed. They're the most oppressed group in the nation and in our state. And therefore, if they're the most oppressed, the most loving thing we can possibly do is to aid them and to stand with them. And, that in and of itself sounds good. That sounds Christian because as Christians, we're called to care for the oppressed. But I think what we need to ask ourselves is, well, are these people actually the quote unquote most marginalized within our community? In fact, are they even very marginalized at all? And the answer is resoundingly no. I mean, women are far more marginalized than the LGBTQ community. Women's wins are being stolen from them. Their team spots are being stolen from them. And almost everyone is bowing down to this idea that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. How are they marginalized? And of course their response would be, well, we're marginalized, we're oppressed because you will not say that I'm a man if I say I'm a man. That's how I'm marginalized. And to me that's just ridiculous because I saw this interview recently, or this interview clip with Michael Knowles and this like radical left-wing journalist, and she was like, I think it's offensive if you're not going to use preferred pronouns. And he was like, well, I think it's offensive if you don't acknowledge me as having the correct point of view and I am completely correct in this way. And she was like, I don't know what to say to that. And that really does get to the meat of the matter. I mean, they think it's offensive if we won't buy into their false narrative. And we're not offended if they don't buy into our narrative because we know we're right. It's just this ridiculous virtue signaling process. And so again, this community is not the most marginalized, and so we need to discount that lie. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be loving towards them, but being loving is not affirming them in a lie, which we've talked about before on this podcast. And then another thing that I think is silly is like, how is standing up for women's rights seen as bigoted now? That's so like darkly hilarious to me.
Yeah.
It's almost so dark that it's not funny, but it also is like, okay, wow. So like standing for women's rights is the oppressive thing to do now. And then one other like, closing thought on this segment is that I think this story in and of itself shows that an apology will never go far enough for the progressive movement. So what I mean by that is, say the progressives are trying to get you to apologize for something you did or said, and maybe you were right, maybe you were wrong, you were probably right. No matter how deeply and like profusely you apologize, they're always going to say, we appreciate blah, 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 but it didn't go far enough. It didn't
Mhm.
go far enough because these people are oppressed. And so I think that's something to remember is you shouldn't bow down to the progressives on this because it's never going to get you anywhere. So those are my closing thoughts on that story. Moses, we do have something else to discuss today, and this is something that I think will be really useful for our audience. We recently had a strategy meeting with all of the directors on our team here at MFC, and Moses took part of that meeting to kind of give an overview of the political landscape here in Minnesota. And it was so informative that we decided he was going to share that on the podcast. So, Moses, why don't you break down what we need to know about politics in Minnesota right now?
Yes, thank you, Grace. So I'm going to try to share my screen because it says that I can do this within this app. If it doesn't work, I'm going to give up. I'm going to just not take too much time on this, but let's see. Can you see that?
I can't right now. Yeah,
Okay.
no, I can't see it.
Okay, I clicked share. I clicked, I clicked window. I clicked the window I wanted to share and it disappeared. All right. So that didn't work, and we're still learning this tool. So I think that maybe I'll try that again next week. But that doesn't hugely matter. I'll just give you guys some numbers. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, we're talking about two things. One of Minnesota Family Council's key goals is to ensure that there's a pro-life, pro-family majority in the Minnesota House of Representatives after the November election. Every seat in that body is up for re-election, so we are laser focused on delivering a win for pro-life, pro-family Minnesotans. The difference between that situation that we have now, where progressives control all three branches of the state government and are able to push through more or less anything they please, unless we are really effective in lobbying members of the Democratic Party who has the majority. And we did see some wins. We talked about that 2 weeks ago with Becca Delahunt. So it's not by all means that we're losing every battle right now. We're not. But if we are able to take back a pro-life, pro-family majority, we will be able to stop much of the progressive insanity with a much higher certainty. So that's the E on the eye chart for us. That is we can't control what happens in the presidential election because, for one thing, we're one of 50 states, and there's 49 other states who have something to say about who will be the next president. I talked about the president in this presentation because frequently your candidate at the top of the ballot, the first thing you see on the ballot is U.S. president, and in a presidential year, right? And so if you choose to vote for Donald Trump and you see that R next to his name, you may be more likely to vote for other candidates with an R next to the name, even when you don't actually know who those candidates are, which is frequently the case when we get down to the state house, state senate level. And by the same token, ditto if you decide to vote for Joe Biden. So it's really important to look at the top of the ticket because that will influence what we're going to see down the ticket. And it's lower down the ticket are going to be those Minnesota House candidates, which we need. We absolutely need some of those candidates to win. We need to gain, I think, a net of 2 to 4 seats to take a pro-family majority in the Minnesota House. So the first thing I shared, and I wish I could show this because it's a crazy, crazy cool map. And I am indebted to a guy on Twitter, Aaron Booth, for putting this together.
Maybe we can have Christine added in on a screen.
Maybe we can, or share it in the comments or something.
Yeah, because it's really cool.
There's a view of Minnesota where you look at all the, I think, census blocks or something, and you can see which ones are red, which ones are blue, and to what extent, right? So from the 2020 election, so statewide, Biden got 52.4%, Trump got 45.28%, and you can see which areas are blue, which areas are red. And there's you can zoom in on the Twin Cities metropolitan area. You can see that, almost all of Ramsey County is blue, and most of Hennepin County is blue, and all of that. But then there's another way to view that map where instead of just looking at a map of the state the way it normally looks, you look at a map of the state as it looks when you divide by population. So census blocks with more people are bigger on the map, and it's crazy. It looks nothing like the state of Minnesota. We were laughing about this. Just like, it kind of looks like an anglerfish coming to eat you, or it looks like a diseased heart,
Yeah.
because it's sort of like there's this huge blue thing, and then there's this red area surrounding it, and then other blue things. And so we got your huge blue thing. That's the Twin Cities.
Mm-hmm.
And the Twin Cities has, in a state of 5.5 million people, the Twin Cities is 3.5 million, or 3 million of that, right? So it's this huge proportion of the state's population, even though Minnesota is, we don't think of Minnesota necessarily as a state that's dominated by an urban population in the way that Illinois or New York is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can see other blue areas. You can see Duluth, you can see Rochester, and then you can see all those red areas, including some really deep red areas around, St. Cloud or Brainerd, or wherever there's a large concentration of conservatives. But it really goes to show you how politically powerful the Twin Cities are.
That's
And I
right.
think it helps people see, like, especially people who don't live in the Twin Cities, don't necessarily and resent the fact they don't necessarily realize how much power the Twin Cities have, and they resent that. But really, when I look at these slides, I'm like, it's actually kind of amazing that we're talking about only a 4-seat deficit or a 3-seat deficit in the Minnesota House, because when you look at the population stats, there's a lot of blue on this map. So that doesn't, it's the same situation we've always been in. It's just that we need to sort of realize that, and realize where the political battles are being fought, because that will help us
Mm-hmm.
be realistic about what we need to do. So, switching gears a little bit, we also wanted to talk about national polls. So since March, there has been a very consistent polling gap, which is about 1 point in favor of Donald Trump. So currently on 538, which is an aggregator of polls, they have 30 or 40 polls represented here. Donald Trump is at 41%. Joe Biden is at 39.8%,
So
and
close.
it's so close.
It's
And
crazy.
that's with those most of those polls include Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is polling at 9.8%, which is, I believe, the best third party showing in quite a long time. Now, of course, it remains to be seen whether that will last until the election, because of tactical voting and all sorts of things. People who might want to support Kennedy, but who, they know if they vote for Kennedy, Kennedy's unlikely to win. They may
Mm-hmm.
choose to vote for one of the two candidates who is more likely to win, depending on which they dislike the least, right? So this is different than 2020. In 2020, Joe Biden was running ahead of Donald Trump for pretty much the entire time. So it's not, we can't call Donald Trump the front runner. He's only 1 point ahead, and
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't come down to the national popular vote either, because it comes down to those, because of the Electoral College, it comes down to those few key swing states: Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and I might be missing one or two, maybe even North Carolina, that are really in play for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, let's talk about Minnesota. So the
Mm-hmm.
most recent poll in Minnesota, released by KSTP in mid-May, we have Donald Trump at 42%, Joe Biden at 44%. So we
So
saw,
close
it's so
again.
close, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
At the national level, Joe Biden is 1 point behind, and the Minnesota level, he's 3 points, 2 points ahead. So just a
Mm-hmm.
difference of 3 points between Minnesota and the national spread.
So who do
Um,
you think will win, Moses? Do you have a guess at this point?
oh man, it would be premature. I think
Okay.
both candidates have different strengths and weaknesses in terms of their polling and in terms of what could happen. We saw, for example, last week we saw Donald Trump convicted of 34 counts of 34
Yeah, maybe
felony.
we'll break that down more on another episode, but
Yeah,
woof.
we might. I don't know all the details, but what I do know is he was convicted of all those charges. And what happened? He immediately was able to raise $200 million.
His pockets go deep, man. His relationships are strong.
Right. And a lot of those Trump donors are not millionaires and billionaires. It's small business owners. It's ordinary
Mhm.
Americans who really feel that there's a political witch hunt against former President Trump. And unfortunately, and I can't speak to the charges, but to whether they were legitimate or not, but I would agree that there's a witch hunt against Donald Trump. I mean, we've seen that for years. There was the whole Russiagate thing, which turned out to be nothing, and a couple things that I found notable in this polling, Grace. So first of all, 0% of Minnesota voters. This was conducted before Trump was convicted. 0% of Minnesota voters said that they would change their vote to Joe Biden if Trump were convicted in the hush money trial. He's now
That's
been convicted.
hilarious. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, and
Is
I
this
think
national or is this on the state level?
that was Minnesota. So
Wow,
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, the Trump voters, people who have now voted for him twice and are preparing to vote for him a third time, most of them, they are not going to be dissuaded by him getting a conviction from this New York State court. They don't believe that a jury in New York City is capable of a fair trial for Donald Trump. They just don't. And I
Either
think,
that or they think it doesn't even matter if he is guilty. I still want him as president.
well, that's exactly right. Yeah,
Mhm.
they would say, well, maybe Trump did that. That's bad, but look at what Joe
Biden
Biden
has
has got
done.
away with. There's accusations that
Mhm.
Joe Biden has been corrupt, and I can't speak to that either. But they basically say Trump is not an ideal candidate, but he's the one who can clean up the swamp, who can put
I
America
do
first.
think it's hilarious that we live in a state where people would rather vote for someone who's convicted, 32 times, 37 times, however many times it was. They would rather vote for him than transfer the vote to someone else. Now, I can't say I'm sad about that because it's not like I want any votes to go to Joe Biden from Minnesota, but I think that is rather hilarious that is
Yeah.
how bad, we have such, in my opinion, we have two candidates that are not great. And wow, this is the situation we find ourselves in.
And it possibly even more strangely than that, Grace. I don't know about Minnesota, but I think in other states, maybe such as like Georgia or other
Mhm.
states where Trump needs to pick up votes, the fact that Trump is being, is under so much legal pressure, that could make him look like the underdog. That
Yeah,
could make
and
him
it's
look like,
so funny because it's making him more popular too, because everyone's talking about it. So people that didn't really think about Trump at all are like, "Oh, now I know that guy," or "I'm thinking about this guy more." It's so funny. I think it the whole situation is again dark because that's awful that a president, a former president has been accused and convicted of so many different crimes.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
also that people are still so ready to vote for him. Wow.
It really does speak not only to Trump's appeal to so many people, but also to the weakness of Joe Biden as a
Yeah.
candidate. I mean, there are just really not that many reasons to think that Joe Biden will do better over the next 4 years than Donald Trump. I'm just speaking totally pragmatically.
He can
It,
barely talk, which is very unfortunate.
yeah, yeah. I think, just this morning there was a headline that went to wallstreetjournal.com. The headline is Biden is slipping. This is one of the
He's
most
old.
respected. He's
Yeah.
old. It's one of the most respected newspapers in the country, and they have a well-sourced article talking to 45 different people, including Congress people, congressional staffers, all sorts of people on
Ugh.
both sides of the aisle who point to signs, not just Fox News clickbait stuff, but really showing that Joe Biden is unfortunately in mental decline.
Mhm.
So a couple other things here I wanted to highlight. So we've talked about RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. What role will his candidacy play? And we did see interesting one more poll in Minnesota in May. This was conducted by a pollster specifically paid for by Donald Trump. So in this poll, we see Donald Trump ahead. Now we have reason to not trust polls that are paid for by candidates because generally the pollsters are going to give them what they want. And in this case, we see three scenarios. One scenario, a head-to-head matchup with Donald Trump and Joe Biden with no third-party candidates. Trump is ahead by 3 points. Now, you can discount that because it was paid for by Donald Trump, but I'm just giving that to you as an FYI. Second of all, a scenario where some of the other third-party candidates like Jill Stein of the Green Party, possibly a Libertarian Party candidate are included. And then we see some decline in both support for Biden and Trump, but we actually see Biden support decline more, possibly to the Green Party, and Trump is up by 5. But then we look at a scenario where there's other third-party candidates are added, but also Robert F. Kennedy is added, and Trump support declines from 46% to 40%, leaving a dead heat between him and Joe Biden in that scenario. Now, that again is just one poll, but it suggests that Robert F. Kennedy's candidacy, RFK Jr.'s candidacy in Minnesota, is dragging down Trump's performance in Minnesota, that we can see some people who are maybe really reluctant to vote for Trump, but they will vote for him if he's the only viable option, the only person they've heard of, perhaps, other than Joe Biden. But everyone has heard of RFK Jr., or at least almost everyone has, because his father was Attorney General, his dad was, or his uncle was President John F. Kennedy. So it's an interesting scenario, and probably a bad sign for Trump. If this is the case in Minnesota, I would imagine it's the case in other swing states, that Trump is going to be, that Kennedy's candidacy is hurting Trump. If Kennedy's numbers start to plummet, if he just seems to be a less and less viable option, that will probably be good for Trump, better for Trump than it will be for Biden.
Yeah.
So lastly, I wanted to talk about some of the demographics of people who are supporting Trump versus those who are supporting Biden, just in Minnesota. So if we look at, and I was so incredulous of this that I looked up the 2016 results. So I'm going to share those. Now, 2016 was obviously different. For one thing, instead of Donald Trump, instead of Joe Biden, we were talking about Hillary Clinton, who had arguably just as many negatives or similar negatives to Joe Biden. I looked at the age demographics of people who supported Donald Trump. This is a poll from October 2016. In that poll, Donald Trump took 36% of the 18 to 34 demographic, 34% of the 35 to 49 demographic, 51% of the 50 to 64 demographic, and only 33% of the 65 plus demographic. Now, it's interesting because in that poll definitely undercounts Trump's strength. Trump ended up coming within 2 points of winning Minnesota, whereas the poll shows he's only ahead in one age group, the 50 to 64 demographic, and he's getting roughly a third of support in the other age demographics. So that's striking. But then we start looking at 2024. The numbers are crazy. Right now, okay, well, this is actually not, just to be clear, this is not a, no, right here, I have the apples to apples comparison. Right now, Donald Trump is at 42% among 18 to 34-year-olds, 41% among 35 to 49-year-olds, 50% among 50 to 64-year-olds, and 34% among the 65-plus group. So, in other words, Trump is slightly weaker among 50 to 64-year-olds and way stronger among 18 to 49-year-olds.
That's not surprising, because I feel like, in general, the older generation would want more, like, quote-unquote respectable president, like, with better manners, and whereas the younger people, the younger demographic is kind of like, he's not very respectable or presidential in the classic sense, but he gets the job done. No. So that makes sense to me.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said after respectable.
Oh, I was just going to say that makes sense to me, because the teens these days are and just the younger demographic in general, the under 40s, are probably more likely to be like, well, we don't love his attitude. We don't love that he's not super presidential, but we like that he gets stuff done. Yeah.
Yeah, the dollar, things are roughly 20% more expensive than when Joe Biden took office. Just one example. And if they can say that inflation has started to go down, that doesn't mean the prices have gone down. It just means that the amount by which they're going up has started finally to decrease. And that's with these punishing interest rates that keep people in their homes. And it really hurts younger people more because they are more likely not to have a huge amount of wealth to be able to weather your groceries going up by 30 or 40%, house prices going up by 30 to 40%, and interest rates more than doubling since Joe Biden
I
took
would
office.
know. I bought a house. It's very crazy.
Yeah, and actually, so did I. I bought a house while Joe Biden
Oh,
was
yeah.
president.
You got a better
And
deal, I'm sure.
well, that's actually true. Interest rates are now more than double than they were when I bought my house. And
Mm-hmm.
so, which puts me in a position right now where we're having another kid and I can't afford to move. Now, I'm not blaming Joe Biden for all of that, but it's certainly going to be part of my assessment as I think about who I'm going to vote for.
Right, because then you're trading like a 3% interest rate for like a 7% interest rate. I mean, I don't know what they're at right now in
Exactly.
Minneapolis or St. Paul, but that's a crazy difference.
Yeah,
And the
exactly.
government is getting so much more money every single month.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So two more things. So I just
Okay.
wanted to put a fine point on this age discussion. So in 2016, Donald Trump had 36% of 18 to 34-year-olds. Hillary Clinton had 49%. Fast forward to right now, Donald Trump has has 42% of 18 to 34-year-olds, and Joe Biden has 41%. So
Well,
yes, there's undecided voters, but Donald Trump right now is ahead among the youngest demographic of voters in Minnesota. It's crazy to me. That is just nuts. Um, the last thing I wanted to highlight was suburban performance. So, what I have here is I have a different poll, which is talking about not Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, but is specifically talking about the Minnesota House. And because people don't know who their House candidates are, and because of the primary system, which is in August, some of those candidates haven't even been determined. So the question they ask is, in Minnesota House election in your district, are you generally more inclined to vote for a Republican or Democrat? Right? In the urban areas in the Twin Cities, roughly 1/3 would vote for Republican, and 60% would vote for a Democrat. In rural areas, 55% would vote for Republican, only 32% for a Democrat. In the suburban areas right now, we're talking about 45% voting for a Republican, 42% voting for Democrat. If that were to hold out, and if some of the suburban seats that we need, we would have a pro-life, pro-family majority in the Minnesota House. So, it's just a poll. We cannot, say that that's what's going to happen. I mean, good heavens, we've seen polls be wrong enough to know that we can't rely on them. But that's really good news. And so,
mm-hmm.
what we'll be trying to do is to just hammer that home, and on the issues that are important to us, but also on issues that are important to everyone. The economy is a family issue. If normal Americans making a normal amount of money, like Grace and I,
Mm-hmm.
for example, are not able to improve our standard of living because costs have gone up so much, then how much more is that hurting really the working class Americans who have higher? I mean, I don't know if I'm working class or middle class, but let's assume I'm middle class. The lower down you are on the economic ladder, the worse the last 4 years have been for you. And that, I think, is the single most important reason why you're seeing younger voters who
Mm-hmm.
are generally less economically less wealthy going towards Donald Trump, which is crazy. Is almost like a suicide, not a suicide vote, but like they've seen everything he did in the last administration, the good and the bad, everything with COVID, everything with his response to the riots, all of that, his just so much. He did so much good and honestly a lot of things that were bad. But Joe Biden still has not been able to close this race. Why? Because of what Joe Biden and his
Yep.
policies have done to the economy.
I
I
mean,
mean, that's
inflation definitely is one of the top issues for voters, no matter the age.
right.
It's
And
one of the things they pay attention to most because it impacts their day-to-day life and yeah, their quality of life even. So, Moses, that was super helpful. Is there any other tidbit you want to leave us with?
no, I think I've concluded that segment, and now I would love for you, Grace, to end this episode as we always do with a verse or a passage from God's word.
Absolutely. And next week we will, of course, tell you what we're reading since we haven't done that in a while.
Mhm.
But let's go ahead. I want to read from James this week. This is James 1. And he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And then a few verses later it says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which he has promised to those who love him." So this verse came to mind this week because one of our board members' daughters passed away on my birthday, actually, on May 23rd. And she was 30 years old, had one little girl, 3 years old, and a husband. And she was fighting cancer for 2.5 years and finally lost the fight, so to speak. And as we were reminded at her funeral, Moses was there too. As we were reminded, she lost the fight on earth, but she gained Christ. She gained everything. A verse that was referenced was, "Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And that's what Lauren Trotter did. That was her name, Lauren Trotter. And she, counted it all joy when she met these various trials, and especially this big trial of cancer, and knowing that she was likely going to leave her family and her young daughter and not see them again until they join her in glory. And she absolutely remained steadfast under trial, and she stood the test, and she has now received the crown of life. And so she's been on my heart recently, and Moses's, since we both knew her. And we would just ask, for those of you listening, that you just pray for the Trotter and Abens family, again, the daughter of a board member of MFC. Sobering note to leave the podcast on, but she truly ran the race well, and so we are not mourning as those without hope. We have great hope. We know we will see her again in glory, and many of you will be able to meet her there too. So her memory will live on, and her memory inspires us to follow her example as she was imitating Christ. So we will see you next week on the podcast. Remember, we come out with an episode every single Friday, and we give you the facts so that you can stand for truth.